You really got your work cut out for you here, James commented, as he, Admir and Tuya helped the local medics with bringing in a much bigger medical cot that may not have been all too heavy but was certainly unwieldy, making the help of the dense Deathworlders highly appreciated. He wasn't entirely sure why he said it, especially since he, too, had his work cut out for him now. Still, some part of his brain just wanted to make idle chit-chat with someone he still considered a friend, but hadn't seen in a while, instead of just being awkwardly silent about it. But since they were here to help out, they didn't really have time to play catch-up with each other.
I'm a lot more concerned about the lives that were lost than I'm about having to patch up a few sprained limbs,
Pippa replied, as she made sure the corners of the bed didn't get caught on anything, while the humans moved it around, having a much easier time with doing that due to her height. Although she was of course right, James was caught slightly off guard by such a serious comment, coming from the Uranik. Right, he quickly mumbled, and decided to keep his mouth shut for a bit, until they had finally gotten the bed through the opening, and past the tarp separating the individual rooms of the tent. Pippa sighed as she watched the humans set the thing down.
"But that's why we came here, so I won't complain,"
she then said, seemingly adding on to her previous sentence despite the pause in between. Her fluffy fur rustled, and she shook herself for a moment before briefly stroking one of her hands across her ear a couple of times, as if it just wouldn't obey her attempts to reposition it. Right, I was about to ask about that, Admir chimed in, far less put off by Pippa's earlier comment than James was, and seemingly eager to get as many answers out of the situation as he could, while he still had one of the medics at hand and not currently occupied. Because both Cliff and the guy in the sickbay said something to the same extent, if I recall correctly. Something about you being here because of us. What's up with that? James internally appreciated it that Admir used "because of us," instead of implying that it was because of him specifically. Pippa shook herself once more, sending her fur into another rustling flight, while one of her flat feet stomped on the ground seemingly involuntarily.
"Well, we have to try to go where we are needed,"
she then replied, with clear hesitation, but also some suppressed underlying feelings that James couldn't quite decipher, as he looked at her slightly nervous face.
"And with you here, well, if people were going to get hurt, it was probably going to be bad enough that the people here would need all the help they can get."
James stood quietly as he listened to that, wondering if he had understood her correctly. However, someone else was a lot less quiet about it.
"I really hope you're not trying to imply that these people got hurt because of us,"
Tuya warned the large Marsupol, with a serious tone, and turned her head to look at the medic directly, probably shooting her a dark glare from under her mask. Pippa paused for a second before she exhaled slowly and replied,
"I am not blaming you for it, if that is what you mean."
James now finally found his voice. "But you do think that it was because of us," he assumed, trying his best to not make his voice sound as accusing as the statement. He needed to hear her say it or explain herself, because right now, that was all he could hear. This happened because of you. And coming from someone he considered his friend, that hurt, even if she said she didn't blame him. Pippa pressed her right hand onto her eye, as she shut both eyes tightly, and her ears sunk a bit.
"Well, in a cosmic sense,"
she said, apparently doing her best to make it sound as appeasing as possible.
"Like I said, I don't blame you. You're not the one who hurt them, and the blame is on those who did, 100%. You're not responsible for what those people do, and I am not claiming or implying you are. But they are still doing it, and that still needs to be dealt with, no matter who's to blame."
There was a clear desire to say more on her face, mixing in with a combination of sadness and compassionate agitation, but before she could let any of that out, she pulled her hand away from her eye and turned back to the exit.
"Listen, I gotta work,"
she said, as he quickly hopped out of the separated room.
"Let's talk later."
James looked after her, and he knew that she was right. This really wasn't the time for it. The people waiting outside needed medical attention, and they should also clear out of this room as soon as possible, so it would be usable again. Still, he was basically frozen in place as he stood there and looked after her for a moment, because it still just hurt, even if she wasn't blaming him. And even if she wasn't wrong in a technical sense, it just fucking hurt, having this be one of the first things they said to each other, after not seeing each other for so long. Was this what people were starting to think of him? That wherever he went, people got hurt? To the point that they already prepared for it with extra medics? A hand on his shoulder shook him out of his gloom. "Come on. We came here to help out," Amir reminded him, with a gentle but firm voice, and began to guide him out of the room. "Because that's what we do." He said "that's" with heavy emphasis, and James knew what he was trying to do with it. "We came here to help. We came here to make things better. We do not hurt people." That's what he was trying to tell him. And although he couldn't fully internalize it in that moment, James appreciated it with a soft smile. "In a cosmic sense, we are only doing what we're doing because of other people abusing their power," Tuya disgruntledly mumbled to herself under her breath, as she joined up with the other two lieutenants, to push underneath the tarp and glide out of the room, her arms crossed, seemingly trying to reassure James in her own way. "We didn't start this shit." However, James couldn't help but sigh. "No," he agreed first, before then bringing his mood around as he glumly added, "but for most of the galaxy, it started with us." Things had been going wrong long before they had all hit the scene. But only with them did it start to get galaxy-wide attention, and only with them actively pushing against it had countermeasures from the other side become more volatile. James quickly shook his head with his eyes shut tightly, trying to chase those thoughts away. He couldn't get into his own head about this. He could not start blaming himself for the things other people did. Even if others would do it, he simply couldn't allow himself to do the same. There were already more than enough things he wasn't proud of. Before anyone could respond to his depressing comment, a loud, fearful yelp from the other side of the tent suddenly caught their attention. It sounded like someone with arachnophobia had just unexpectedly walked in on the large spider. As their heads synchronously snapped around to the source of the noise, they could already see some medics jumping out of the way, while a large form came stumbling backwards towards them, while others remained in place and tried their best to keep the patient from running straight through the tent's tarp, so they wouldn't accidentally tear it down in the process. The patient themselves was a Rhedopago, the same large, feathered Saurpsida species to which the first Deathworlder James had ever met out of the human territories belonged to. What had been their name again? He couldn't really wonder about that as he began to rush over, in order to help the medics with keeping the patient from running into things, both so they wouldn't cause any damage to their surroundings, but also so they wouldn't further endanger themselves and make their own wounds much worse. However, after only taking 2 steps, he stopped again, because it was then that he realized what the fearful person was even so desperately trying to get away from. Or, more precisely, who. With their hands calmly raised, Andrej and Sam were both gently and slowly backing away from the panicking person, doing their best to indicate that they weren't a threat, and were not trying to be either. Meanwhile, Coco had taken a much more direct approach to things and had simply turned on the spot and power walked away from the patient, putting a safe distance in between her and them a lot quicker, even if in a way that was a lot less calming. They were there! The feathered link between a reptile and a bird-like being meanwhile loudly screamed, as they seemingly found their voice again. "They were there just before the explosion! I saw them!" In a split-second decision that didn't need any communication, James and Admir had hurried forth and quickly grabbed their colleagues, pulling them out of their professional and responsible, but in this case not really all that helpful retreat, and towards the same back entrance they had entered the tent through. And just as they did, the security people stationed outside, including Cliff with Sheeta in tow, hurried inside the tent, clearly stirred up by the sudden commotion. After taking one long look at the situation, Coco sighed.
"Let's go,"
she ordered with a wave in the exit's direction. And although she wasn't technically the leader here, she did still outrank everyone else who was present, meaning nobody had any real problem with heeding her command here, especially given the fact that they were clearly doing more harm than good at this point. As he passed Cliff, who was rushing in to aid while he left, James couldn't help but say, "Sorry about this." Although Sheeda seemed slightly confused about what had happened, she still followed the rest without question, as they all ducked underneath the tarp and quickly grouped up, about 10 measures away from the tent to catch their breaths and decide what's next. "Well, that was a fine mess," Andrzej announced, after they had all taken a moment to readjust. "Copy that, sir," Amir concurred, as he brushed some imaginary dust off his shoulders. "Guess volunteer work is out," Athena agreed with the both of them, while fiddling with the ring on her middle finger, and briefly shaking her ponytail aside. "And if rumours start to spread, it would probably be best to get our asses off the road." Tuya scoffed.
"What? Because racist off-worlders can't tell two humans apart from each other, we're supposed to lock ourselves in?"
she countered, and crossed her arms. It was relatively clear that she was more against the idea of the action than the action itself. At least James doubted that she was about to suggest any sightseeing in the near future. "To be fair, we are wearing masks," James mumbled, ironically being the only human here who in fact wasn't wearing a mask. It also self-admittedly wasn't the most helpful comment given their situation. He just felt like he should still say it. The conversation fell quiet for a moment, as everyone exchanged a couple of glances. Eventually, James could feel something tap at his fingers, and he quickly grasped Sheeda's hand tightly after the offer occurred to him. "We're all tired," Coco then announced as the voice of reason. "We're all tired and pissed and unsure about what will happen next. If we try to do any more right now, we're just going to mess up. Let's all just act like adults here. We're going home. We're going to rest. And we're going to await further orders. Official statements will most likely be out by tomorrow. Everybody, prepare to get moving." After a brief hesitation, the soldiers complied, and in a studied order of events, Admir pulled out his phone to study the best connections they would have to make it back to the hive in the best time, and with the least possible attention pulled onto themselves. Meanwhile, everyone else kept an eye on the situation around them. "Looks like we can take the regular J5A62 train. That's the closest one still driving," Admir explained, after less than a minute of searching, before switching to a linked map to mark the quickest route to the closest stop for them. As everyone was getting ready to move, there was suddenly the scratchy sound of clawed feet running across hard ground, causing them to turn their gazes at whoever was approaching them so hastily there. The station's light displays happily scattered around her, quickly stepping feet, as the snow-white woman came running after them with waving arms. Piercing blue eyes locked onto James's face, as his eyebrows raised a bit higher in recognition. Halting everything for just a moment, James turned completely in her direction, as Thither gradually slowed her steps, now that she had been noticed, breathing deeply from the sudden sprint she had broken into, while she closed the last bit of distance. "James!" she let out, in between gasps as she came to a halt, and her eyes briefly twitched over to the person at his side as well. "Sheeda, Pippa just told me you were here. How good to see you two." James was slightly hesitant to respond, still feeling a bit burned after his very brief talk with Pippa earlier. Sheeda, whose interaction with Cliff seemed to thankfully not have hit herself in the same way, quickly raised her hand in greeting.
"Hey there,"
she replied politely. "Sorry about what happened in there," James followed up as soon as he had found his voice. "Is everything back under control?" Thither released a brief chirp and nodded.
"We gave the patients some medicine to calm them down," she informed quickly. "It's not the first time someone panicked in our tent. You don't have to worry about it."
James exhaled slowly. "That's good to hear," he said. Thither nodded again. Then, She reached out her lower left arm, holding a small piece of paper.
Listen, Pippa and I are really tied up here at the moment, and I'm sure you have mountains of work to do yourself. But if you want to catch up a bit later when things have calmed down a bit, these are our current contacts, she explained, while James carefully took the paper from her and looked at it for a second. But even if you don't, it's good to see that you're healthy. It seems like whoever is stitching your wounds now is doing a good job.
Inadvertently, James curled his mechanical hand into a fist at the comment. Yeah, he replied, as Fiver briefly glanced down at the mostly covered prosthetic. And it's good to see you're doing well too. He briefly scanned over her snow-white feathers, which seemed to be in pristine condition. She was certainly taking good care of herself.
Alright, I have to get back now. Still plenty of people who need attention,
Fiver then announced as she turned back to the tent, seemingly satisfied with James having taken up the offer of the contacts.
Be safe, you guys. Success to you.
You too, James and Sheeta both called after her, as they already watched her leave again. Well, that was something. Before James could spend a long time thinking about it, there was once again a hand on his shoulder.
Call her when we're back,
Coco advised him with a pat on his back, before nudging him along so they could finally be on their way to, like Athena had said, get their asses off the road. Luckily, whatever rumours there may have been about humans being involved in the attack seemed to not yet have spread across the larger population, and so they weren't bothered any more than they usually were, as they first made their way to the train station, and then drove most of the way back to the hive before quickly taking on the last bit of the way on foot again. All James could think about as he stared out of the train's windows, and down at the people going about their day below, was how glad he was that they had decided to leave Nia and the others behind when they went to pick up Sheeta. The thought only came to him because he thought about how much harder the way back would have been, given Nia's dislike of public transportations like this one. However, he then soon realised that they had just been confronted with broken and dead bodies all around them, with most of them barely batting an eye. He had been so desensitised by his renewed military training that he had barely thought about how glad he should be that his friends and sister didn't have to see any of that. After they had reached their stop, the light displays at the station were their constant companions, as they moved along the walkways quietly. None of them had anything to say right now. What Coco had said earlier was true. They were all tired and pissed and unsure, not exactly conducive to small talk. In fact, the sparkly displays were so bright and constant that their brain began to mostly filter them out, to the point where they almost didn't notice the flashing signal light shining not too far in front of them, as they only really stuck out from the rest of the constant light noise because of their colour. For a second, James's heart almost wanted to skip a beat. However, luckily, they were still a good bit too far from the hive itself to raise any direct alarm bells. Therefore, they simply kept up their walk as they approached what seemed to be a single ambulance parked on the ground level of the station, its signal lights constantly flashing, even though any audible sirens were thankfully turned off. However, as he realised that there was a quite frankly huge person sitting next to it, while a medic seemingly took care of a wound on their major arm, James briefly tilted his head in surprise, and as they came closer, he couldn't quite help but speak up. "Everything all right, Mr. Strentane?" he asked the huge Ligamordalar, who was getting his arm bandaged there, and James deeply and truly hoped that this would not have anything to do with any of them for a change. Moguth blinked in surprise as he turned his head, and the massive digging claws that curled in front of his chest like a breastplate clacked against each other for a moment, while the thick scales covering his body rattled as he moved to lean over slightly. "Mr. Aldwin," the man greeted with surprising enthusiasm, causing Sheeta to quickly twitch to cover her ears, as the Colossus's thunderous voice boomed down at them. "Absolutely. This little scrape's hardly worth mentioning." He moved his arm as if he wanted to show off the wound, almost sending the Laxaset medic working on it flying in the process, had the Volpe not reacted quickly and backed off. An annoyed chitter from the Deathworld medic then informed the Colossus to please not move while he was being bandaged. That looks like a stab wound, Athena commented from behind James, after she had only gotten a very brief glance at the injury, while the giant moved his arm. Did you get into a fight, Representative? Her worried tone was a professional courtesy. A fight? Hardly. The enormous Class 5 Deathworlder replied with a bit of chuckling. A fight would indicate both sides had a chance. This was more of a lecture. Listening to the man, James began to understand why Conglorch had such an immediate respect for the guy. Just some delinquents who use any opportunity to cause trouble. The giant then continued his explanation, and released a proud burst of air through all four of his nostrils on his nose and forehead. I overheard them when they discussed their plans to make the lives of you and your companions just slightly harder than they already are, and I decided to step in. Next to him, James could see Sheeta's ears twitch. You got stabbed? For us? The feline asked in disbelief, and James could understand her skepticism. So far, it had not seemed like the Ligamordalar had an especially high opinion of their merry little band. However, Morgoth laughed it off. Seems you take a lot more punishment for other people who can't defend themselves nearly as well, he said almost casually, and his voice dropped several orders of magnitude in volume. I saw your speech at the conference, and I respect what you said. I have to admit, I was thinking that you were someone just rousing trouble without much cause, or maybe that you were out for revenge for your arm there. But I am willing to admit when I was wrong. He paused briefly while looking down at his wound, while the medic finished with patching him up. As a Class 5, the guy was very clearly tough as nails and barely cared about the injury itself. At that moment, it seemed to be more about what it meant to him. Back on my homeworld, you can't survive on your own, he then mumbled, his voice becoming even quieter, now almost reaching a level akin to an inside voice. I mean, you can now, but you couldn't always. Standing alone is seen as something akin to being dead. Ligamordalar never stand alone. And it is the duty of the strong to be there for the weak. The way you said you would be there for the weak, and for those who stand alone. You and I, we want the same. He looked up at the blinding lights from above for a moment. The community has given a lot to my people. As the only Class 5, we are often seen as the symbols of sturdiness, the strongest who can survive anything. But fact is that life was hard before the community came. Resources were scarce and our world was unforgiving. And although things were slowly getting better with technology advancing, they only really got good through the trade with and support of other worlds, he explained further. And now I would like to give back. People in fear, people in need. Let them all lean onto me. I am strong, I can take it. But I'm not quite there yet. He exhaled, and then looked down at James, who had been carefully listening to him. The Ligamordalar's almost completely black eye stared directly into James's. You know, we didn't invite humanity to the conference because we were afraid of the image they would bring. What is basically the face of the current galactic tensions of Deathworlders. That was seen as suboptimal for establishing ourselves as a serious force for peace and political harmony. We wanted to avoid our conference causing any risk to the community, as much as we could, he said directly, chuckling at the statement awkwardly, almost as if he expected James to be insulted by that. I don't know if we will be able to sway everyone's mind on that, but at least personally, I want to apologize for my antagonizing actions in the past. And although I see many good people at your side, let me still assure you, as long as I stand, James Allwyn, you will not stand alone.